Good morning. Welcome to our second lecture. Today we're going to talk about Man-Q Chapter 4, which is the model of supply and demand. This is, of course, our classic model in economics. If you run into somebody who doesn't know anything about economics, then, well, they know about supply and demand. It's kind of the cliche thing that you hear people say about economics when they don't know anything about economics. It's that common, it's that widespread. Before we get into it, though, I want to remind you, be sure to get my notes from eCampus. I told you that last time. Get my notes. This lecture will be far more valuable if you have my notes. Last time I talked about economic models. We said an economic model is an analytical, a graphical, a mathematical depiction of what we see in the real world in terms of economic behavior. A model is simplified, it's far more simple than the real world, but a good model still captures the essence of what's going on in the real world. It's impossible to capture the complexity in the real world. We don't even want to do that. We're not trying to do that. What we're trying to do is to capture the essence of what's driving real world behavior. And a good model it does a good job at capturing that essence, but it's also workable. It's simple enough that we can learn it and use it and understand it and apply it and use it to communicate with each other in a very workable, useful framework. And I think supply and demand is that. I think if you actually understand the supply and demand model, which hopefully you will here very soon, I think you can understand so much real world behavior with what is a very simple, very straightforward analytical framework. So that's supply and demand. It's so simple. So first and foremost, with supply and demand, as you see the very beginning of my notes, if you're following along with me in my notes, you'll see this defined at the very top of the Chapter 4 section. In supply and demand, we're assuming that we are operating in perfectly competitive markets. Perfectly competitive markets. That's defined as a market with a sufficiently large number of buyers and sellers such that each one is so small that he can't affect market outcomes. He can't affect the market price. So if I'm selling widgets in a competitive market, then I just go to the market and whatever the prevalent price is, that's what I sell my widgets for. I don't have the power or the ability to drive up prices myself. Same thing, if I'm a consumer, I just have to take the market price as given. There's a million consumers out there. I'm just one. I have no ability to affect the price that I pay. I just take the price as given. Another way that we word this is that we say we exhibit price-taking behavior. Sellers and buyers, they're price takers. They just take the market price as given. Here we're also assuming that we have perfect information. We know exactly what we're getting. We know what our options are. There's not any kind of secrets out there. We know exactly what's going on. And we have a homogeneous product. So, the widgets are the same. You go to the first seller, the second seller, the third seller, wherever you go, the widgets are the same. There's not higher quality or lower quality widgets. We're just assuming a homogeneous product. And then we also assume there are no external costs or benefits. We assume that my behavior as a consumer, your behavior as a producer, whoever, our behavior doesn't affect anyone else directly. There's no external cost or benefits. That's what that means. We'll talk about, other scenarios where these assumptions don't hold later on. But right now we're starting out in this really classic case where everything kind of works out perfectly with large number of buyers and sellers / price-taking behavior, with homogeneous product, with good information, complete information, and with no external costs or benefits. There's a whole spectrum of markets out there, and competitive markets are kind of one extreme end of that spectrum. On the opposite end of that spectrum actually is monopoly. But we'll talk about that whole spectrum later on, but right now we're starting in the extreme with perfect competition. I'm going to share my screen so I can get over here to my notepad so I can scribble along as we go. here's the picture of the market. We depict quantity of the good being sold, produced on this side. And then over here, we depict the price, dollars per unit of the good. We have the demand curve, and we have the supply curve. Oops. That's what the model looks like. It's a very straightforward, simple model on the surface, even though, as you'll see, there's a lot to it, and there's a lot that we can do with it. It's very useful as we go along. We'll start by talking about the demand side of the market, and we'll start by talking about just an individual. Here, I'm going to use a lowercase q, and I'm going to use a lowercase d, because we're just talking about an individual. The way the demand curve works is you give me a price, just pick this price at random, and then go to the demand curve, right? Just go over to the demand curve and then go down, and that'll show you the quantity, right? Here's P1, here's Q1. At this price, this is the amount that the consumer wants to buy. At this price here, P2, again, just go over to the demand curve and read off the demand curve, go down to the quantity axis. That's the quantity that the person wants to buy at P2. You give me any price up and down this axis, I'll give you the price, the amount that the person wants to buy. That's what the demand curve is. It shows the relationship between the price and the quantity that an individual is willing to buy. The way to think about demand fundamentally is demand is the same thing as the marginal benefit. It's the same thing as the marginal benefit curve. Let's just draw it again. Let's just label this marginal benefit. Marginal benefit means that this is the additional benefit that the consumer receives for each additional unit of the good. Let's suppose we're talking about ice cream. It's summer now. Today's June 1st. It's summer. It's hot. It's great. It's awesome. We're talking about the market for ice cream, the marginal benefit that a person receives from ice cream. Suppose here's our first cup of ice cream or first cone of ice cream. Person receives a high marginal benefit from that first cone. First cone of ice cream is really good on an 85-degree day after you've been working in the yard. Second cup of ice cream, cone, is still good, but it's not quite as good as that first one. If you get way over here to like the 10th cone of ice cream, you're not getting much additional benefit from the 10th cone of ice cream. You're kind of getting sick now. And this can even extend down into negative territory, right? It can't even go below zero. You can't eat so much ice cream that the last cone even makes you sick. It gives you a negative benefit because you've just had too much ice cream. I think it should make sense to you that marginal benefit is diminishing as quantity increases. Each additional unit of ice cream is giving you less and less additional benefit. The first cone is awesome. The 12th cone is bad and sickening and makes you nauseous. But now think about it this way. Here, I'm going to draw my graph over again because it's getting messy. Okay, so here's a price. Just forget about sellers, forget about the market, just assume this is the price and forget about anything else. Here's the price the consumer faces, and here's the consumer's marginal benefit function. How much would the person want to buy? Would the person want to buy the first unit? We'll go to the first unit and go up and read how much additional benefit the person gets for the first unit. Right? Here's the first unit. Here's how much marginal benefit the person receives for that first unit. They're getting a lot of benefit, and the benefit they receive really exceeds the price. It exceeds the cost that they have to give up to consume that first unit. So the person should really buy this first unit. They're getting more benefit than they are having to give up in terms of the cost. it totally makes sense to buy the first unit. Should they buy the second unit? The same logic still holds. The marginal benefit for the second unit isn't quite as high, but they're still getting, right here, the marginal benefit they're getting still exceeds the price they have to pay. The person should buy the second unit because they're getting more benefits than they are facing in costs in terms of the price they have to pay. How about if we go way over here to the 10th unit, right? For the 10th unit, the marginal benefit's down here, right? For the 10th unit, the marginal benefit isn't as high as the price. It would make no sense for someone to buy the 10th unit because what they have to give up in terms of the price is more than what they receive in benefit. You'd be dumb to buy that 10th unit because it's not worth as much to you as what you have to pay in price. This is what we'll call Q star. Q star, call it whatever you want to. A rational consumer would buy all the units up until Q star. All the units up until Q star are more valuable than they are costly. All the units past Q star are more costly than they are valuable. It wouldn't make sense for a rational consumer to buy units on past Q star. You wouldn't pay, that price when the good just isn't worth that much to you beyond Q star. So it's weird. You just think about marginal benefit. A marginal benefit curve, which is derived from someone's fundamental preferences, it is the demand curve, right? If you give me a marginal benefit curve for a rational consumer, you can give me any price and I can tell you how much that consumer will want to buy at that price. That's straightforward. It's not, this is very logical, it's straightforward, but that's what it is. I mean, the marginal benefit curve is the same thing as the demand curve. The marginal benefit curve is the demand curve for an individual consumer. Think about it that way. How much benefit do you receive for each individual, for each unit of a good? That marginal benefit curve tells you essentially how much a person would want to buy. That marginal benefit curve is the demand curve. So now we want to talk about the determinants of demand. I'm sorry. Scratch that. Before we get to that, I want to talk about individual and market demand. Okay, individual and market demand. You can see how I'm following right along in my notes. So suppose in this market, suppose we have just two consumers. Here's the demand for Jack, right? Here I'm using lowercase q, lowercase d, because this is the demand for just one person, Jack. Suppose in this market, suppose there's only two people. Jack and Joe. I'm sticking with J names here. Their demand curves are different. Their marginal benefits are different because they have different preferences towards this good. They're different people. Some people might like ice cream. Some weird, crazy people might not like ice cream. That's, so demands are going to be different for different people. Suppose we just take a price of $10. Just randomly, I just pulled that out of the air. It doesn't matter. But we have this price of $10. Suppose at a price of $10, Jack wants to buy 5 units of the good. That's just his demand. That's his marginal benefit. He wants to buy 5 units at a price of 10. Joe, on the other hand, at that same price, he likes this good more. He's more inclined to this good. He wants to buy 8 units of this good at a price of $10. Now, if these are the only two people in the market, we can come over here and we can use uppercase and we can draw the market demand. And here, use an uppercase D, here at a price of $10, the market demand is just simply 5 plus 8, 13. That's all we do to go from individual to market demand. sometimes we use the term, and I don't know if this even makes sense or not, but this is just the term that we use because it looks like this is what we're doing, but we sum horizontally. We are summing horizontally. We take a given price and we look at how much the first consumer wants to buy at that price. We look at how much the second consumer wants to consume at that price. We sum across those consumers. We get the market demand is that sum, is 13. Simple as that. We could have 100, we could have 1,000 consumers in this market. It's the same idea. We're just summing across all those different consumers horizontally at each given price. We can do this for a price of 10, we can do it for a price of 1, we can do it for a price of 100, we can do it for all the prices along that spectrum, and the result will be the market demand curve. So to move from individual to market is not a big deal. Now, we're going to get back to where we were a second ago. Determinants of demand. Determinants of demand. Now, first and foremost, the price determines the specific quantity demanded. You give me a price, I can tell you how much people want to buy at that particular price. That's what we said before. That's straightforward. Price determines quantity demanded. But the demand curve, this demand function, encompasses all prices. When we say determinants of demand here in this context, we're talking about factors that actually move or shift the demand curve, something that changes in society, that changes this entire relationship, okay? We're not just simply talking about how the price selects a specific point along the curve. We're talking about factors that change the entire curve. So the first factor is income, okay? Income. So for normal goods, as income goes up, then demand goes up. So this entire curve increases or shifts to the right. There's demand 1, it goes to demand 2 as income rises. So for a given price, right? So for P1, before the market wanted to buy this many units at P1, but now that demand has shifted, we now want to buy a higher quantity at that same price. As income goes up, demand goes up for normal goods. So I have a guitar collection. I love playing guitar. I pride myself on my guitar collection. Unfortunately, I don't have it in the background here. My guitar collection is in the basement, but whatever, I could point to it if it were here. So for me, I didn't have very many guitars when I was, a student, when I didn't have much money, or when I was destitute, basically, when I was in school. But as my income rose after I graduated, after I got a job, blah, 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 then my demand for guitars increased, right? Back when I was in school, I had 2 guitars. Now I have 9. So there you go. So for any given price, people want to buy more as income rises for normal goods. That should be very intuitive. I don't think anybody's going to be freaking out trying to understand that concept. Second example is income, but not for normal goods, but for inferior goods. In this case, as income rises, demand actually falls. It moves in the opposite direction. It moves down or to the left. The example that I give here, and some people might be offended by this example because some people just love this, but the example that I give is ramen noodles. Okay, again, sorry if you're just in love with ramen noodles. But for a lot of people, you say when they're in college, they eat a lot of ramen noodles because they're poor and they can't afford expensive stuff. But as they graduate, as they get a job, as they earn more and more income, their demand for ramen noodles actually falls because they shift away from ramen noodles and start buying better stuff, lobster or whatever your example of a high quality food is. So a rise in income leads to a rise in demand for normal goods, a rise in income leads to a fall in demand for inferior goods, things like ramen noodles. Second determinant of demand is the price of substitute goods. Price of substitute goods, goods that you can just use in place of each other. So here, I don't know, a simple example might be Pepsi and Coke. Pepsi and Coke are substitutes. For the most part, people can just buy either one. I personally, I guess I slightly prefer Coke, but I don't really care. I can certainly drink either one. So if the price of a substitute goes up, then the demand for the good in question goes up, right? If we're talking about the demand for Coke, if the price of Pepsi goes up, that's going to mean the demand for Coke goes up. That has to be straightforward, right? If we have substitute goods, if the price of this one over here goes up, I'm going to shift away from that. I'm going to start buying more of the substitute. My demand for the substitute is going to go up. Again, this is not hard. This is intuitive. This is straightforward. You're not going to have to really rack your brain to try to understand that. 3, complementary goods. The price of a complement goes up, then the demand for the good in question goes down. Complementary goods, the classic example here is, see if you can think of one. Pause for 1 second to see if you can think of what I'm going to come up with. The classic example is peanut butter and jelly, right? They're complements, they go together, right? This is the complete opposite of substitutes. Peanut butter and jelly go together. So if the price of peanut butter goes up, then I'm not going to be consuming as much peanut butter naturally, but then I'm also going to reduce my demand for goods that go with peanut butter, like jelly. Okay? 4, which is very straightforward and most closely tied in with this notion of marginal benefit, is just preferences. Right? Just people change, right? Over time, people decide that they have a higher preference towards this or a lower preference towards that. Maybe there's a huge marketing campaign for a huge product, and that product was around before, but now that this marketing campaign has taken place, it's just convinced me that I just really want this good. I really have to have this. So as preferences towards a product increases, for whatever reason, there could be a million reasons behind that. As preferences towards a product increase, then my demand for that product also increases, and vice versa. The next one, I forget what number was I on? 5? The next one is just simply the population or the number of buyers. We showed before that we're just summing across all individuals to arrive at the market demand. So if the population increases or if the number of buyers increases, then we're just simply summing across more individuals. So obviously an increase in the number of buyers leads to an increase in demand. That just follows from that little example we did a second ago, showing how we arrive at market demand. That's simple, that's straightforward, there's nothing to it. And then the last one is the expected future price. The expected future price. Suppose the expected future price goes up, what does that do to demand today? Think about that for a second. You think you're driving home one afternoon, going by the gas station, on your way home. You think for some reason, maybe you saw a news story that says there's turmoil in the Middle East and that's going to disrupt the availability of oil and therefore gas. You're driving home and you think that the price of gas is going to go up in the next few days. What are you going to do? You're going to stop and buy gas today before the price goes up, according to your expectation. So if the expected future price goes up, the demand for gas today goes up. Does that make sense? Think about the reverse. If you expect the price of gas to fall over the next few days, then you're not going to buy gas today, if you can help it. You're going to wait until the price falls. If the expected future price falls, then demand today will fall, right? That should be straightforward as well. All of these should be intuitive. All of these should be something that you can follow along with and understand without a whole lot of trouble. To switch to the other side of the market, we'll go to the supply side. I'll use lowercase just because I'm talking about an individual firm, whatever. Supply is the, it has the same interpretation. You give me a particular price, I can just simply read off the supply curve. That will show me how many units of that good that a business wants to sell at that price. It's, it's completely the same flip side of the coin. You give me a price, I can read off the supply curve and show you how many units a firm wants to sell at that price. Price can be thought of as marginal cost, the marginal cost to the firm of producing particular good that we're talking about. Again, same idea. Here's the supply curve, here's the marginal cost curve. It's the same thing. Suppose here's the price that prevails in the market. For the first unit, if I'm a firm, would I want to produce the first unit? Well, this is how much money I can get out of the first unit, right? I sell it at that price. This is how much money I'm going to receive for that first unit. We go down here to the supply curve, and this is the marginal cost that I incur for producing that first unit. So I'm going to make money, right? If I produce the first unit at this marginal cost and sell it at this price, then I'm going to make money. It makes sense for me to produce that first unit and for me to sell that first unit. For all the units over here, up until price equals marginal cost, it makes sense for me to produce those units. Way over here, at a unit, for way out here at, let's say 10, whatever, 100, put in whatever number you want to. Over here, the cost that I incur for producing the 10th unit is more than what I'm going to get in additional revenue, because the marginal cost exceeds the price. It would make no sense. It would be dumb for me to produce this 10th unit and incur a higher cost than what I get in additional revenue. So I'm going to produce just up until Q star. I'm going to produce just up until price equals marginal cost. All these units below that point, I'm making money on those units. All those units above that point, I'd be losing money on those units. Don't want to produce those units. I produce just up until price equals marginal cost. So in the same way that the marginal benefit curve is the demand curve for an individual consumer, the marginal cost curve is the supply curve for an individual firm. There's more to it than this, and we're going to get to the additional detail and the additional concern a few chapters down the road. But for now, just understand that basic point, and that basic point will serve you well. Now, marginal cost is increasing because of diminishing marginal returns. Firms, well, we're going to talk about diminishing marginal returns later on. We're going to talk about that in much more detail later on. So, don't worry about that for now. But the notion is, beyond some point, for any firm, the cost that they incur for producing additional units rises as the number of units rises. That's true for any firm. It's because of diminishing marginal returns. And it always sets in for any firm beyond some point. As far as individual supply and market supply goes, what we have is the exact same approach, right? When I summed across the individual consumers horizontally to arrive at market demand, I would do the same thing here. I'm not even going to bother to draw it. It's just the same idea. As I sum across individual producers at every given price to arrive at the market supply for the good. Next, we have the determinants of supply. one thing, the first and foremost is price of inputs, right? I mean, if I'm producing whatever, then I have to buy, let's just say I'm producing, let's just say I'm producing bicycles. Right? To produce bicycles, I have to buy metal, I have to buy rubber, I have to buy these plastic items, all this stuff that goes into bicycles. I have all these inputs that I have to purchase as I buy bicycles. So again, you have to remember the supply is marginal cost. So for the first unit, this is the marginal cost of producing that first unit. If the price of inputs rises, then what happens to that marginal cost? It goes up. Right? For the first unit, here's the marginal cost to begin with. Price of inputs goes up. The price of those raw materials that I have to use goes up. Marginal cost goes up. That's true for every point along the supply curve. So supply shifts in that direction if the price of inputs rises. You have to think of it as the marginal cost curve. If the price of inputs goes up, my marginal cost of producing units goes up. For every unit, for unit 1, for unit 2, for unit 3, for unit 4, that marginal cost is higher for each of those units given an increase in the price of inputs. So this is what we call a leftward shift in the supply curve. But look at it. For any given price, it's a reduction, right? This is how much I would have sold to begin with. But now after the supply curve has fallen, after the price of inputs has risen, then now I'm only willing to sell Q2 units. So this is a drop in supply. Price of inputs goes up, supply goes down. Does that make sense? Price of inputs goes up. You think of it this way: marginal cost increases for every unit. Just draw that out. For every unit up and down through here, the marginal cost is higher. That gives us this new supply curve, S2. And then just look, how many units would the firm be willing to sell at a given price? That number has fallen now with this shift in supply. This is a leftward shift in supply. This is a drop in the supply curve. I'm emphasizing this a little bit because it almost looks like supply went up because supply went up on the page. But that's not true. It's not true. This is a drop in supply, despite the fact that it looks like it's going up vertically. And all you have to do to kind of remember that is just look at how many units would the firm be willing to sell at any given price. The next one is technological change. Technological change. I'm going to draw out the graph again for this one just real quick. Here's a supply curve. If we have a technological improvement, I mean, technology could, in theory, go down, but we're just going to assume kind of the norm that we have a technological improvement. Technology is going up. Here's the supply curve. It's the same as the marginal cost curve. Technological improvement is going to lower our marginal cost. For every one of these units, marginal cost is going down. So supply is shifting in that manner over here to S2. For any given price, this is how many units we wanted to sell to begin with. This is how many units we want to sell now. This is an increase in supply. Technological change leads to an increase in supply. I'm sorry that my notes look so scribbly. I'm trying to squeeze them into a relatively small space. If I were doing this on the board, it would look so much better. technological change or an improvement in technology lowers marginal cost and therefore increases supply. The third example is number of firms in the market. As the number of firms goes up, then supply goes up. That should be intuitive at this point, right? It's just you're summing horizontally across more firms now with an increase in the number of firms. So ultimately, when you get to the market supply, then you're going to have an increase in supply. That's straightforward. That's not hard to imagine. And then the last example is the expected future price. If the expected future price goes up, then what's going to happen? Firms aren't going to want to sell today, right? If you think the price is going to go up tomorrow, you want to hold off and wait till that higher price arrives. So you'll want to cut back on your sales today to wait on that higher price. Supply will go down in response to an increase in expected future price. So all these should be intuitive, right? I mean, like I don't have all this stuff memorized. This stuff should be intuitive. I just think through it logically. Like, what happens to demand with a change in the price of substitutes or a change in the price of complements? What happens to supply with an increase in input prices or technological improvement? I just think about each one of those intuitively, thinking about demand as marginal benefit, supply as marginal cost. I don't memorize it. I just think about it intuitively because that's the way it should be. You know, it's not going to be as effective to try to memorize this. Just try to understand it and go through it logically. Your last topic of this chapter is market equilibrium. We've talked about the demand side of the market. We've talked about the supply side of the market. Now we just want to think about how the market works as a whole. Here's the market demand. Here's the market supply. Now, what happens in the total market once we have an established demand curve that's based on preferences, that's based on price of complements, price of substitutes, number of people, those other factors that we talked about. And once we have an established supply curve that's based on, you know, price of inputs, technology, those other factors that we talked about. Let's just assume this. Let's just assume we have a random price. Just start out randomly. Here's random price 1. Okay? What's going to happen at that price? Just go here, and this shows you quantity demanded 1. That's the number of units that people want to buy at that price. But also at that price, here's quantity supplied 1. This is the number of units that firms want to sell at that price. This doesn't work, right? This isn't stable. The number of units that people want to sell is more than the number of units that people want to buy. That's not stable. That's not going to last. This is what we refer to as this difference, right? This distance between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. We refer to that as an excess supply, or you could also call it surplus. It's an excess supply or surplus. There's more units floating around out there than people want to buy. That's what's referred to as. This is a disequilibrium. It's not stable. In this case, price is going to have a natural tendency to fall. Price will fall. It will continue to fall until we get to this point. We call that P star. Price will continue to fall until we get to that point. And when price reaches that point, then we'll get here to Q star, right exactly where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. The number of units that people want to buy is just equal to the number of units that firms want to sell. This is what we call an equilibrium. It's an equilibrium. It's a stable point in the market. There is no surplus. There's no excess supply. Price will be stable. Price will settle there. The market will arrive at that point. Economists believe that the market arrives at that point through just natural forces, right? We think naturally that this surplus will lead to a natural tendency for price to fall. We think that price will fall until we reach this stable point. The surplus will put pressure on the market to cause price to fall until we reach that equilibrium. Let's just go through one more example just for the fun of it. I know you all love this stuff. Suppose we start out at this price. Again, just randomly. I pull that out of the air, you know. But at that price, here's the quantity supplied. There's the number of units that firms want to sell. Over here, this is the number of units that consumers want to buy. That's not stable. That's not a good outcome. This distance, right, this difference between the number of units that people want to buy and the number of units that businesses want to sell, this is called an excess demand or shortage. You have more people wanting to buy stuff than we have firms willing to sell this stuff. It's no good. It's not stable. This is not an equilibrium. It's a disequilibrium because there's this shortage in the market. When this happens, there's going to be a natural tendency, a natural pressure for price to rise. And price will continue to rise until we get to this point, until we get to P star, until we get to Q star, until we get to that new equilibrium. This is a fundamental part of what economics is, of how we believe markets work. When there's a surplus, there's a natural tendency for price to fall. When there's a shortage, there's a natural tendency for price to rise. That will happen to naturally achieve this stable equilibrium in markets where the number of units that people want to buy is just equal to the number of units that people want to sell. When quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And it's as simple as that. Okay, that is the basics of chapter 4. I'm going to make a separate example to come back. I'm going to make a separate video to hold on. I'm going to stop screen share. That's the basics of chapter 4. I'm going to make a separate video. It's going to be a short video, but I'm just going to put it into a separate file to come back and talk about a few examples of how this stuff works. But understand the basics of what demand represents, how it is marginal benefit. It's the same thing. Understand the basics of those determinants of demand. Understand the basics of what supply is, those determinants of supply, and understand how markets naturally reach this stable point, this equilibrium, in response to pressure from excess demands or excess supplies. All right. I'll be back soon.